Many Michigan fans aren't aware of this, but the University of Michigan has a major rival outside of Ohio State. And no, I'm not talking about Penn State, Ohio State, Iowa, any of the SEC teams, any of the Pac-12 teams. I'm not even talking about a team that still plays football in the Big Ten today. What I am talking about today is the rivalry in the early to mid 20th century between the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago. This rivalry, spearheaded by two legendary coaches, Fielding H. Yost coaching for Michigan, shown here on the left, contrasted by Amos Alonzo Stagg coaching for the University of Chicago. Each of them legendary in their own right, helped create a rivalry that decided many championships in the early 20th century and helped start one of the earliest and greatest college football rivalries of all time. This is Michigan vs. Chicago, the forgotten rivalry. Now, to understand this rivalry, we need to understand how football at these schools started. Shown here is Michigan's first football team, where they started playing football in 1879. You can see the U of M logo painted onto the football in the center of the screen. Michigan played its first college football game against Racing College in Wisconsin. Michigan made sure that they were ready to play them and postponed the game almost half a year in order to ensure that they could win this game. Here, you can see a flyer for the game advertising the event. On the flyer is a cartoon image that gives you a better idea of how the game was played back then. It even includes a racing flag on the goalpost. The University of Chicago was started in 1890, co-founded by William Rainey Harper, who served as the first president, and funded by J.D. Rockefeller, the Standard Oil founder and very, very rich man. Together, they decided to create a university that could be the Ivy of the West, something to rival the Ivies of the East, the Harvards, the Yales, the Princetons, known for their academics, but also blooming athletics. All of these schools were huge players in college football in the early 20th century and late 19th century. As the University of Chicago was being built, they decided they needed to have not only great athletics or great academics, but great athletics. This is why they hired Coach Amos Alonzo Stagg to run their athletic department. As mentioned, Stagg is a legendary coach. His accolades include multiple championships. He even has the Big Ten title trophy, or Big Ten Conference title trophy, named after him currently. Stagg started by playing baseball at the University of Chicago, shown here on the right in this picture. He also was a player coach and captain of the team for the University of Chicago's first football team in 1892. You can see Stagg here holding the ball. The rest of the team donning that iconic UC shirt. For reference, Michigan having been playing since 1879, was a well-established football team. Here you can see their 1892 team. Featured on this team is player George Jewett. George Jewett was the first African-American varsity athlete to play at the University of Michigan. He also had a major role in the first game between the University of Chicago and Michigan this season, as he scored 2 touchdowns and helped score a third. Michigan also donning the iconic Block M on their jerseys. Now going through the timeline, we start in 1892. As mentioned, Jewett had a major impact, scoring 2 touchdowns for Michigan, as Michigan wins against Chicago 18-10. Now as this game starts, it's already close, or as this rivalry starts, the game is already close, and a rivalry is born. Because in 1893, Michigan loses unexpectedly. Chicago, who had started playing a year prior, beats Michigan, an established football team. This only solidifies the rivalry, as now it is 1-1. But in 1893, they actually played twice. So Michigan, having lost already, comes back and they beat Stag's Chicago team 28-10. They beat them handily. Moving on to 1894. Now we can see how this game is getting more media attention. This paper has more than, the Chicago Tribune has more than half of its page dedicated to this game now, even showing multiple diagrams on how football is played and different types of plays of football. However, it does not matter, as Michigan beat Chicago 6-4. In the following year, 1895, Michigan wins again. Here you can see a familiar slogan, Championship of the West, which would become to be known as Michigan, the champions of the West. Also, important to note that 6,000 people came to this game. 6,000. That may not seem like a lot, but for the time, that was a good number. And we will see how that number only grows. 1896, Chicago wins. Chicago wins 7-6. And not only do they win, but they play the first ever indoor college football game. They play at the College Coliseum. You can see here, this is a clipping from the Chicago Tribune, how they were experimenting with playing under a roof. And all things considered, it went well. The roof did not interfere with any of the game. The only difficulties they had were with lighting the Coliseum, but they were able to make it work. Now, 1897, another Thanksgiving game, which had been a recent tradition for the past 4 or 5 years. Michigan loses again. They lose 21-12. However, it wouldn't be a rivalry if it didn't go back and forth. 1898, considered one of the greatest games in the rivalry and one of the greatest games of the time. Michigan wins. They win 12-11. Champions of the West, printed directly on the front page of the Michigan Daily. Also, very popular, something known as Widman's Run. Widman, a player for Michigan, had a 65-yard run that was unheard of at the time. It was so popular that this popular drawing was made of it. What also happened as a result of the 1898 game was Louis Elbel creating the Victors. The Victors, the popular Michigan fight song declaring Michigan the champions of the West. Moving on to 1900. Michigan loses, and they lose bad, 15-6. Now fans are getting tired of losing, and they need change. However, something a lot of people may not know is what Chicago had to do to win that game. Now you might think Chicago won fair and square, as most teams do, going back and forth in a competitive environment. But a little known fact found in the Chicago Tribune is that Chicago made a blood sacrifice of a rooster during the game. This rooster, which was nicknamed Pete, was actually killed as a sacrifice in order to come back and beat Michigan, because Michigan had been winning. A Michigan student even tried to save the rooster, thus potentially saving the game, but failed at that, and the rooster was killed. And then Chicago came back and beat Michigan. Now, what is the outcome of this rooster being killed? Well, Chicago wins, but Michigan wins the war. Michigan hires Fielding H. Yost as its coach. Now, I think it's funny that potentially Yost could not have been hired, or at least not as hired at the same time, because if Chicago didn't kill the rooster. If Chicago didn't kill the rooster and Michigan wins in 1900, potentially Yost isn't hired as a Michigan coach. Or if he is, it's not till much later, and he doesn't win as many championships with Michigan. Moving on, 1901, Yost is hired as a coach. And what do? Immediately start winning. Yost has a patented point-a-minute offense where he brings in new schemes, hurry-up offense, he moves fast. And they beat Chicago 22-0. Not only do they beat Chicago, but they beat everybody, and they win a championship. Here on this team photo, you can see the score: 501 points scored for Michigan, 0 points scored against. Moving on to 1902. Michigan routs Chicago once again, 21-0. Michigan would go on to play Stanford in the Rose Bowl, beat them 49-0, winning a second championship. 1903. Michigan beats Chicago once again, winning a third championship. You can see here the team photo, including Yost, looking very happy.
From the Library of Congress in
Here's
Washington, D.C.
Here's a video of the 1904 game between Chicago and Michigan. Having this game recording represents how this rivalry was entering its peak. Obviously, technology is not what it is today at this time, and having the money and resources to record a game between these two powerhouse teams shows how popular these games were. You can also see by looking into the stands how crowded it was and how so many people wanted to watch these teams play. Obviously, the game was much different than it is today, as it is yet to undergo multiple rule changes. Here's a good example of showing how packed the stands were. Every seat is taken, and even the standing room is occupied. I do wish that the videographer was able to capture the jerseys better. It would be cool to be able to tell who's playing for Michigan and who's playing for Chicago more easily. Moving on, Michigan would win that game, and they would become, once again, national champions. But in 1905, Chicago would finally win, beating Michigan and winning the Western Football Championship. Famously, Michigan's player Denny Clark would make a mistake, causing a safety, which would lose Michigan the game. Unfortunately, this eventually led for Denny to kill himself 20 years, almost 30 years later. Very sad. Now, we have a 13-year jump in our rivalry. What happened? Well, Michigan leaves what is the conference over many reasons, but mainly they felt that the rules were unfair and purposely targeting them and Yost. So Michigan votes to leave the conference. However, they come back in 1917. They vote 8-1 to re-enter the conference after struggling to find opponents and have good quality of play for almost 10 years. And what do they do on their first year back, 1918, playing Chicago? They beat Chicago. They beat Chicago 13-0. A good win for Michigan, which would eventually be claimed as another championship. In 1919, Stag comes back and beats Michigan 13-0, just as Michigan did to Chicago the year previous. In 1920, it flops again. Michigan beats Chicago, this time 14-0. Notice here, you can see the players for both Michigan, Chicago, and their position. A fun fact is if you look at the quarterback for Chicago, you will see Fritz Chrysler. Fritz Chrysler played for Chicago against Michigan and would later become a Michigan football head coach. After a 7-year scheduling break, they come back in 1927, and Michigan picks up right where they left off, 14-0. Notice 60,000 watched Michigan defeat Chicago. 60,000. Now remember, only 20 years previous, it was 6,000. Now there is reason for that. It was the first game in 7 years, and between two very competitive teams in a very popular and known rivalry. But nonetheless, record-setting attendance and very impressive considering the time. They don't play again till 1930. And in 1930, Yost is no longer the head coach. Yost retires from coaching duties, sort of, in 1928. Now he retains the position as athletic director and still has some influence over the football team, but is no longer the coach. Also, between 1927 and 1930, Michigan Stadium has been constructed. So for the 1930 game played in Ann Arbor, Michigan defeats Chicago 16-0, tying for the Big Ten title. Now, moving into the final leg of the rivalry, 1931. We beat Chicago again, 13-7, closer, but still a good win for Michigan. 1932, Stagg's last game as head coach. Stagg is outed of Chicago, mainly by the faculty, as he and the faculty have differing views on the role of academics or athletics in academics. This famously would lead to the lack of Chicago getting a new stadium and the ultimate demise of Chicago's football program. 1932, Stagg's final game, and Michigan shows no mercy, 6-0, shutting him out on his final game in his coaching career. This would eventually lead to another Michigan championship, shown here in this photo with Yost. 1933, Michigan destroys Chicago 28-0. At this point, this game is becoming less and less of a rivalry and more of a one-sided blowout every year. 34, Michigan loses to Chicago handily. So when Chicago seems to be on the ropes, they come back and beat Michigan 27-0. This is partially due to quarterback Jay Berwanger. He won the Heisman Trophy and was eventually the first player ever drafted into the National Football League in 1936. He's a very good player for Chicago. They don't play again till 37 for more scheduling conflicts. And here, Michigan comes back and beats them 13-12. Chicago is unable to keep up the winning streak. In 38, Michigan has a new coach. Fritz Chrysler begins coaching for University of Michigan. The ex-Chicago player is now coaching for his rival school. And in his first year, he destroys his alma mater, 45-7. And in 39, the final year of the rivalry, it doesn't get better. Michigan destroys Chicago, 85-0. Not even a close matchup whatsoever. This reflects poorly on Chicago, as Chicago starts getting questioned. The legitimacy starts getting questioned by the rest of the Big Ten. I found this clipping from a Michigan Daily paper, which is asking alumni and students on if Chicago should be kicked out of the Big Ten. And not surprisingly, some people are all for it. Chicago had been losing to Michigan for quite a while and losing to many other teams. And people wanted better competition. So in 1939, the University of Chicago gives up football, the only Big Ten team to ever leave the conference. It leaves December 22nd, 1939. However, its legacy still lives on, as the Big Ten Conference Champions Trophy is named after Coach Alonzo Stagg. However, you won't be able to say that the University of Chicago would ever be able to raise that trophy, as Michigan still exists as a very strong college football program today and continues to excel. This is how two teams, once shrouded in competition and rivalry, changed over time, and how putting effort and money into your football program can have dramatic differences over time.